All right, so welcome to our panel. Our panel is the role and future of animal sanctuary. So we'll be addressing the role and future of animal sanctuary. Really happy to have you all here. There are three of us here presenting. There should be four. I'm filling in for my colleague, Cristina, who unfortunately is homesick. So you're only getting three of us. But we will be each presenting on a topic. And then for those of us joining virtually, you can submit questions via the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. For folks in the room, as you probably know by now, you can go up to the mics and ask us questions at the end when we open it up. I will introduce each of us. I'll start with myself. I'm Cristina Stella. I'm a managing attorney at the Animal Legal Defense Fund. I focus more on our farmed animal work, but as I said, I'm speaking here today for Cristina, who's a staff attorney who works on our captive animal work. And I'll be speaking about the intersection between litigation and animal rescue and the need for sanctuaries. We have Gwen Jakubisin. She's the executive director of Lighthouse Farm Sanctuary in Saya, Oregon. That's okay. I didn't check how to pronounce that, just your last name. Lighthouse Farm Sanctuary is Oregon's oldest farm sanctuary, where Gwen cares for almost 400 rescued farmed animals. She also works as the social media specialist at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, where she manages our social media accounts as well as online advertising and reporting. And she will be speaking to us on the role and importance of animal sanctuaries. Senatori is the Associate Director of the Center for Animal Law Studies at Lewis and Clark Law School, an adjunct professor of companion animal law, and probably most relevant today, the co-founder and president of Sheltering Animals of Abuse Victims, or SAVE. SAVE is an all-volunteer nonprofit organization that arranges for animals safe harbor when a domestic abuse victim seeks refuge from an abuser. Over the past 20 years, SAVE has provided safe refuge for more than 300 animals impacted by domestic abuse in Dane County, Wisconsin. And she'll be speaking to us about sheltering animals of domestic abuse victims. So with that, I'll turn it over to Gwen.
Hello, thank you all for coming today. As Cristina mentioned, my name is Gwen. I'm the executive director of Lighthouse Farm Sanctuary. We're the oldest sanctuary in the state of Oregon. So this year we will be celebrating our 22nd year of offering a safe and peaceful refuge to rescued farm animals. The animals that come to Lighthouse are rescued from situations of neglect and abuse. They've been rescued from the animal agriculture industry, from small backyard operations, and from legal cases like hoarding. We provide a lifelong permanent home to cows, pigs, horses, donkeys, sheep, goats, turkeys, chickens, ducks, geese, and rabbits. Every single one has a unique and inspiring story of overcoming incredible trauma and adversity. I hope today to introduce you to a few of them, talk a little bit about my experience running a farm sanctuary, the role of sanctuaries in our movement, and what the future looks like for sanctuaries from my perspective. For me, my role as a sanctuary caregiver and a friend to these amazing animals is to tell their stories, to educate people about how individual they are by highlighting their unique personalities, and to sever the separation between us and them, by allowing people to see them for who they are when they're given the freedom, respect, protection, and care they deserve to grow and develop into their full personalities. They deserve to be protected. They're not commodities or products, but individuals who form deep bonds, experience emotions, and have complex cognitive abilities and lives that matter to them just like us. To begin, the story of how I came to be the executive director of Lighthouse Farm Sanctuary is a bit unique. About 7 years ago, due to a series of unfortunate events, the sanctuary was on the verge of closing, and the fate of the animals was tenuous, to say the least. My partner and I were longtime volunteers at the time, and we couldn't let the animals lose their home. So against our better judgment, we loaded up all of our belongings, our 4 dogs, 2 bunnies, and 1 pig, and embarked on what would become the most challenging experience of our lives. We initially anticipated being at the sanctuary for a year, maybe less, to raise funds, bring in some new volunteers, some staff. But what we quickly learned is that volunteering at a farm sanctuary is much different than running the day-to-day operations, and it wasn't that easy to break away. We had to learn everything from the ground up, how to recognize if an animal was sick, how to administer medications, to the less interesting but just as important aspects of running a sanctuary like pasture management and farm maintenance. We had to learn how to be fundraisers, volunteer coordinators, contractors, vet assistants, and business administrators. One of the comments that I hear more than any other, and I've heard more than once just at this conference, is that when I tell people I run a farm sanctuary, they say, "Oh my God, that is my dream. I want to run a farm sanctuary." I see people's eyes light up with visions of hugging cows and frolicking with pigs and rolling green fields and fresh country air. And it sounds so idyllic and lovely. And in a lot of ways it is. But what I found to be true is that those small moments of joy throughout the day can be outweighed by the stress, trauma, and heartbreak that is inherent in this work. The bottom line is that running a farm sanctuary is hard, but it's necessary, especially for those we care for. This is Betsy. Betsy was rescued from a small dairy farm in Oregon. After years of being bred for milk and having her babies taken away from her, which is standard practice in the dairy industry, her body was giving out on her, but her failing body is actually what enabled us to rescue her. Because she was no longer of use to the dairy, we were able to negotiate her release to our sanctuary. Upon arrival, we found out that not only was Betsy pregnant, but she was also suffering from a painful mastitis infection that had been left untreated. She required months of treatment, and there were times where we were worried she wouldn't survive. The day that Betsy gave birth to her son, Oliver, she became highly agitated and aggressive. She wouldn't let us into her stall or near her newborn baby, and honestly, for good reason, because up until that point, her entire life had been a cycle of giving birth and having her children taken away from her. Even after months of gaining her trust, she was still afraid that we were going to do the same thing. What we quickly learned is that when given the space, freedom, and care she deserved, Betsy is an incredible mother. After years of never having the chance to care for her young, Betsy embraced being a mother with her entire heart. Oliver was and is her everything. Even now, 6 years later, Betsy and Oliver are never apart. If one gets sidetracked in the daily adventure, you can hear them mooing for each other from across the pastures. Their bond is a beautiful and poignant reminder that all animals value family. One of the most rewarding aspects of this work is the opportunity to watch an animal who has suffered so much finally enjoy life, to embrace the joys of freedom and the feelings of safety. He's so cute. So Gumby was rescued as part of a hoarding case in 2019. It was a classic story of good intentions, somebody who wanted to care for animals, but fell into a challenging time and unfortunately ended up putting hundreds of animals at risk. Over 200 pigs who had not been spayed or neutered were living on a tiny 2-acre property with little access to shelter, clean water, or food. The pigs made nests out of junk and debris that was strewn around the property just to stay warm. Many were underweight and all were suffering from parasites and mange, which is a painful skin condition. But sweet Gumby was suffering worst of all. Gumby was left to languish in this tiny little stall for years. The only access that he had to the outside world and to his friends was a small hole in the wood siding that some of the smaller pigs had gnawed in the wall so that they could come in and snuggle with him. This small act of bravery is likely the only companionship that Gumby ever encountered. He was deprived of everything a pig needs to have a happy life. But worst of all, he was deprived of being with his companions. Pigs are herd animals, and so to be shut away alone and isolated caused Gumby to experience severe depression and anxiety. And physically, his body told the story of his confinement. His muscles were atrophied from lack of use, and he suffered from painful arthritis from severely overgrown hooves. It was said that Gumby was confined to the shed because he was aggressive, but the Gumby we knew was sweet, kind, and gentle. After providing Gumby with the care that he needed to feel his best, including trimming his hooves and taking care of his parasites, We were incredibly lucky to witness a transition from a depressed, frightened pig to a pig who was not just surviving, but thriving. After years of being confined to that windowless shed, he now had access to 54 acres to explore to his heart's content. He could spend his days finding the best wallow, hunting for acorns in the forest, or if he felt like it, spend the entire day snuggled up in a warm barn with his friends. He now had the freedom to spend his time exactly as he wanted, and he was so happy. His joy for life was incredibly infectious. He loved to excitedly greet you with hot pants, which is a pig's unique and completely adorable way of communicating their hellos. He loved a good belly rub. He relished in the experience of having clean water to drink and regular healthy meals. But most of all, Gumby embraced the incredible fortune of family. We often called him Grandpa Gumby because he could always be found comforting the shy and quiet pigs in the herd who needed extra companionship. Sadly, after a year of freedom, we started noticing that Gumby was slowing down, that he was losing weight. And after taking him to the vet and running some diagnostics, we realized that he had had some conditions that had been left to fester because he wasn't getting the proper care for years. And a cancerous tumor in his stomach had grown to the point that nothing could be done but to keep him pain-free and have him let us know when he was ready to go. Often, the animals we rescue have such broken bodies from years of abuse that all we can offer them in their short time is to experience freedom, peace, and happiness. But that quality of life, no matter how short, is better than none at all. Gumby and I formed an incredible bond, one that I will cherish for the rest of my life. He taught me so many important life lessons, that it's possible to heal from trauma, how to learn to love and forgive again, how to see the beauty in every day, how to be a better friend, and that when given the chance, we must live our lives to the fullest. Many people would never know the rich and complex emotional lives of a pig like Gumby or a cow like Betsy. We were raised believing that pigs and cows are food, not emotionally intelligent individuals who above all else want to live. Besides the role of sanctuaries to provide lifelong care for rescued animals, we also offer the public an opportunity to get to know these individuals by either visiting or following the animals' lives on social media. Rescued farm animals who experience the freedom, safety, companionship, and well-being of sanctuary life develop into happy, healthy, compelling ambassadors for others of their species who are hidden from the public in animal farming operations. A flawed belief system has taught us to numb our natural compassion and to act against our own values, and it has led to a global atrocity of unimaginable suffering for billions of farmed animals and trillions of fishes. In our society, farmed animals are seen as abstractions. A pig is a pig, and all pigs are the same. However, that is a myth, and the truth is clearly seen every day at sanctuaries for rescued farm animals. 80% of people live in urban areas, and they have very little contact with farmed animals. So visiting a farm sanctuary is likely the only time that they have the opportunity to meet a cow, pig, chicken, turkey, sheep, or goat, and to learn in real time their unique personalities and form bonds with them. This can be an incredibly transformative experience for people where they can see themselves in the animals at the sanctuary and make more compassionate choices in their day-to-day lives. And that's why sanctuary work is so important. So what is the future of sanctuaries? That is a question that I don't have a concrete answer for, but from my experience over the last 10 years, I can tell you that the road ahead is tough. Every year, sanctuaries struggle to adapt to crises beyond our control. Climate change causing more frequent and violent wildfires, flooding and hurricanes, as well as forcing us to contend with hotter summers and much colder winters. More instances of diseases like avian influenza threaten the lives of the animals we care for, and prices for necessities like hay and grain keep getting more expensive. For example, in the last 3 years, a bag of pig food has gone from $11 a bag to $30 a bag, and a bale of hay from $11 a bale to $25 a bale. At Lighthouse, we go through roughly 277 bags of pig food and 250 bales of hay every single month. So caring for animals for their entire natural life is pricey. For example, to offer Betsy a long, happy life at sanctuary, we're looking at an average of 25 years of care, including vet expenses, feed, hay, maintenance on structures, and in more advanced care as she ages. And a well cared for pig has a lifespan of 15 to 20 years. With inflation, we're watching the cost of caring for animals rise year after year, making it incredibly difficult for us to meet our caretaking needs. And in addition, the reality of sanctuary life includes compassion fatigue, depression, and anxiety. And because there are no free or low-cost mental health resources available for sanctuary caregivers, many give up, or worse, they don't feel comfortable asking for help for fear of being judged by their peers, and end up causing more harm than good, as was the case in Gumby's rescue. Without a solid support network, sanctuary life can be incredibly isolating and overwhelming. But even with these seemingly insurmountable challenges, we have to keep going because sanctuaries must continue to not only exist, but thrive, because countless animals like Gumby and Betsy need us. I like to imagine a future where animals are appreciated for the unique and sentient individuals they are, where they are treated with respect, justice, and freedom from harm, and where they are no longer suffering to satisfy human desires. A future where every animal is recognized as someone, not something. Activist James Cromwell said, "One day, hopefully, humans will come to their senses. All farms will be sanctuaries and mankind will have a future. Compassion is the only answer to what ails us." So until that day comes, I encourage you to help your local sanctuary in whatever way you can by either donating money or time. And if as a lawyer you find yourself litigating for the release of an animal to a sanctuary, a good rule of thumb is to make sure you have some sort of funding available to help with at least the beginning costs like vet expenses and feed, but even better, lifetime support for that, financial support for that animal. Because sanctuaries can only continue to do our crucial and life-saving work for the animals who desperately need it with your support. Thank you. Cristina, I took this with me.
Thank you.
So many things to carry. Okay.
All right, so as I mentioned, I'm filling in for my colleague, Cristina, but I'm going to try to do her presentation justice by talking a little bit about captive animal litigation, legal loopholes, and the important role of sanctuaries in the work that we do. Okay. So one kind of starting place to orient us to where the role of sanctuaries really comes into animal law litigation is where are we rescuing animals from who then become in need of sanctuary. So we rescue most of the animals that we do through litigation from roadside zoos. Roadside zoos are small, unaccredited zoos that exhibit wild and exotic animals without even remotely properly caring for them. Animals held captive at these facilities suffer from poor conditions, injury, and disease. They're forced to live in small, dirty cages, are fed inadequate food that's not healthy or appropriate for their species. They're denied medical care, and they lack mental stimulation. These facilities could not and do not meet the standards of zoos that are accredited by the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Roadside zoos primarily exist to make money for their owners and to entertain the public. They're small facilities that are owned by people without any specific knowledge, background, or training in caring for animals. So as a result, roadside zoos are often unwilling or unable to spend the funds that they generate from visitor admission on animal welfare and care. Roadside zoos also often breed animals and trade animals, and often illegally. So the photos on the slide kind of demonstrate how animals at roadside zoos are forced to live. There's a brown bear in a tiny barren corn crib cage at Cricket Hollow Zoo in Iowa on the top left. On the top right is a gray wolf in a rusty, dirty cage from a traveling menagerie based in Ohio. She is also used to breed hybrid wolf-dog puppies, and she's likely housed here with her own offspring. And then on the bottom, we have a tiger suffering from injuries at the Tiger Creek Animal Sanctuary in Texas. And obviously, although the facility has sanctuary in its name, it's not at all a legitimate sanctuary. So how does the problems that we face at roadside zoos relate back to sanctuaries? When animals are rescued from these facilities by animal advocates like the Animal Legal Defense Fund or removed by the US Department of Agriculture, they need somewhere to go. And the issue of where to place them is an ever-present concern in animal law litigation. So I'm going to walk through kind of the regulatory process that applies to removing animals and our work to ensure that animals at these facilities end up in reputable sanctuaries. So what laws govern roadside zoos and rescuing animals from them? We really just have one, the Animal Welfare Act. The Animal Welfare Act, or the AWA, is the primary federal law protecting animals used for exhibition. It was passed in 1966, and it sets the floor for the minimum requirements that facilities are required to comply with when they possess animals who are subject to this law. The AWA is enforced by a subdivision of the US Department of Agriculture called the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS for short. To operate lawfully, animal dealers and exhibitors must be granted a license from APHIS or be registered under the Animal Welfare Act, and they have to commit to comply with the law. Under this license and registration scheme, APHIS conducts unannounced inspections of the regulated facilities and animals at least annually. When a USDA inspector inspecting a facility finds an AWA violation at a facility during that inspection, they note it on a report and expect the facility to correct the violation and come into compliance with the AWA. If the facility doesn't fix the problem, or if they rack up additional AWA violations, then USDA has additional enforcement tools. Warning letters are the most often used enforcement method, but there are others like settlement agreements. The USDA can also bring administrative proceedings in front of an administrative law judge and ask for penalties like monetary penalties, cease and desist orders, asking that a facility stop a certain practice, or USDA can move to have the facility's license removed. Although these enforcement tools exist, USDA does not often employ them. The agency has a practice of letting violations slide and looking out for their quote unquote customers, which is the term the agency uses to refer to the facilities it inspects. License revocation is incredibly rare, and USDA really only uses it as a last resort. Facilities where USDA actually takes the extraordinary step of revoking a license have such horrendous conditions and chronic unaddressed violations that USDA is essentially saying there's no way the business can meet the minimum animal welfare standards required by the AWA. And currently, USDA regulations ignore the issue of what happens to the animals in the rare instances where a license is revoked. This is really the crux of the problem. Once a facility loses its AWA license, the animals at the facility stop being protected under the AWA, which is backwards since they are the animals most in need of USDA protection. The Animal Legal Defense Fund calls this practice revoke and run. The USDA revokes the AWA license of a problem facility and then runs, abandoning the animals at a facility that's already proven to be unable to provide minimum care and humane treatment. Separate from license revocation situations, the AWA also mandates that the USDA create regulations that allow for inspectors to confiscate animals from licensed facilities if they're suffering due to AWA violations. But current USDA regulations only allow for confiscation in narrow situations. Before an inspector can confiscate a suffering animal, the USDA inspector must notify the facility of the animal suffering and ask the facility to alleviate the suffering. After giving a facility an opportunity to address that animal, if it has not been addressed, then an inspector may confiscate the animal if it determines that the animal's health is in danger. So basically, confiscating a suffering animal very rarely happens. USDA has lots of discretion in how it uses its confiscation authority. And currently, it does not use its confiscation authority to remove animals after it revokes a facility's license. So just to give an example of what this looks like in the real world, Cricket Hollow Zoo really demonstrates the problems with USDA's lax enforcement of the AWA and its policy of abandoning animals at facilities with revoked AWA licenses. Cricket Hollow Zoo was a roadside zoo in Northeast Iowa that exhibited hundreds of exotic animals. The zoo also had a history of chronic AWA violations, including receiving warnings and thousands of dollars in penalties. They were a known bad actor to the USDA, but the agency never took concrete action to help the animals suffering there. The Animal Legal Defense Fund led 6 lawsuits against Cricket Hollow Zoo on behalf of itself and Iowa activists who cared for the animals there. One of the lawsuits represents the first time that the Endangered Species Act was successfully used to protect captive wild animals. That was in 2014, and as a result of that lawsuit, we were able to rescue the animals protected by the Endangered Species Act. But that left all of the other animals who are not protected by the Endangered Species Act still at the facility. Under continued legal scrutiny and pressure from ALDF, the USDA finally instigated license revocation proceedings against the Cricket Hollow Zoo, and an administrative law judge ruled that the animals there were suffering, that the violations at the zoo were so numerous that the facility had to lose its license. Cricket Hollow Zoo losing its exhibitor's license meant the zoo had to shut down, but that didn't mean anything for the animals who were still housed and living in the same or worse conditions that led to the license revocation. All that happened was that the zoo lost its revenue stream because it could no longer charge admission to visitors to exhibit the animals. So it had even fewer resources to devote to animal welfare. While the USDA was in the midst of administrative proceedings to revoke Cricket Hollow Zoo's AWA license, the Animal Legal Defense Fund brought another lawsuit against Cricket Hollow Zoo using Iowa state law, alleging that the facility's violations of animal neglect laws constituted a public nuisance. If you've been to the Animal Law Conference before, you've probably heard us talk about this a lot over the years, but we won that lawsuit. And in finding that Cricket Hollow Zoo was a public nuisance, the court awarded ALDF the right to relocate and transfer the AWA protected animals from Cricket Hollow Zoo to reputable sanctuaries. So that was an incredible result for the animals there. We were successfully able to relocate hundreds of animals to sanctuaries, but unfortunately, before we could transfer all of them, Cricket Hollow Zoo and other wildlife traffickers hid, killed, removed, or sold almost 100 animals. We've done a lot of work to locate those animals and make sure that they finally would end up in reputable sanctuaries. We were able to locate some of them, but unfortunately, we still don't know what's happened to some of them. But if not for the concurrent civil litigation efforts of ALDF, the Cricket Hollow Zoo animals would have just remained there in a state of suffering even after the USDA revoked its license. So essentially, the USDA would have abandoned them. Another example that I'll just speak about briefly is relates to what happens to animals where the USDA confiscates them from licensed facilities. So since 2020, there have only been 2 instances where USDA confiscated suffering animals. One of those instances involved Robert Sawmiller, who operated a traveling menagerie called Wildlife on Wheels. Sawmiller is another known bad actor to USDA. He was one of the wildlife traffickers who took animals from Cricket Hollow Zoo so that ALDF couldn't actually rescue them. And some of those animals died during transport due to stress. Before the USDA confiscated animals from Sawmiller, ALDF had sued the USDA under the Administrative Procedure Act for rubber stamping the facility's AWA license, even knowing that they had numerous AWA violations at the time that they requested renewal. During this lawsuit, the USDA initiated administrative proceedings to revoke Sawmiller's AWA license. So that mooted ALDF's lawsuit, trying to have the license revoked, but ultimately it was a good thing since it meant that USDA was actually taking action. Before USDA revoked Sawmiller's license, they confiscated 5 grizzly bears, 2 black bears, and a cougar from Sawmiller because the animals were in, according to USDA, a state of unrelieved suffering. The animals were emaciated and did not have adequate shelter. You can see in the photo here on the right are bears in their enclosures where they have no protection from the elements or any enrichment or anything like that. And then on the left-hand side, that is their hibernation enclosure. So they only have this rusted metal barrel that's just the size of their bodies to hibernate in. And USDA found the inside of these barrels covered in scratch marks from the bears trying to get out. So the happy ending to this story is that the animals confiscated from Sawmiller were transferred to the Wild Animal Sanctuary in Colorado, where they're living out their lives in a safe environment that's responsive to their needs. I wish I had a photo of that on the slide that you can imagine. So this is an example of where confiscation actually took place, albeit after animals were already subject to prolonged suffering. So what are we able to do about this? So the Animal Legal Defense Fund is very actively trying to close the legal loophole in the AWA that allows APHIS to revoke and run, or to leave animals at a facility after revoking a license. In 2016, ALDF submitted a petition for rulemaking to the USDA to create a new regulation that would require the USDA to confiscate suffering animals when the agency revokes a facility's license. The USDA ignored our petition for rulemaking until this year, when we sued them to remind them they had not responded under the Administrative Procedure Act, challenging their 5-year delay in responding to our petition. So the lawsuit forced USDA to finally respond, and unsurprisingly, they denied our petition when they finally did respond. They denied the petition on the basis that they don't have authority to confiscate animals who may be at risk of suffering, as opposed to animals who are already suffering, and because USDA does not think that confiscating animals from facilities with revoked licenses would be a good use of agency resources. So they basically just doubled down on this revoke and run policy. But ALDF is now challenging that denial in court. The case is ongoing, it's just started, so we're really hopeful that our litigation will bring an end to this unjustifiable practice, so that animals who are living or held captive at facilities whose AWA licenses have been revoked can actually be rescued and relocated to sanctuaries. And just to mention some future considerations and things that folks can do. Civil litigation to help captive wild animals cannot happen without sanctuaries to care for the captive animals who are rescued. So looking to the future, some ways to strengthen protections for captive animals and to support sanctuaries. First, we need to close the legal loopholes in the Animal Welfare Act that allow USDA to revoke licenses and run and abandon suffering animals at closed down problem facilities. It should not take 6 separate lawsuits by nonprofit organizations to rescue the animals at a facility when the USDA already knows that the animals are suffering, as was the case at Cricket Hollow Zoo, and when USDA itself has the authority to do what we are asking it to do. So hopefully our suit will be successful to close that loophole. We'd also like to strengthen current laws by creating the infrastructure to support animal confiscations and to care for these rescued animals for the rest of their lives. In the case where USDA confiscated animals from Robert Sawmiller, the agency relied on the Wild Animal Sanctuary to transport and care for the animals and to bear the cost of transport and lifelong care. Sanctuaries should not be expected to carry these costs. That should be the role of the regulatory agencies tasked with protecting the animals and, of course, the facilities who abuse them in the first place. Another way to strengthen the current laws is to prohibit captive animal breeding and trafficking, because this is the main way that roadside zoos get animals to exhibit. And by stopping the problem at the source, we could prevent future animal suffering. And finally, as you know, hopefully you'll learn from the panel today, the importance of supporting legitimate sanctuaries and all of the incredible work that they do for individual animals. Obviously, don't visit roadside zoos, or roadside zoos distinguish as sanctuaries. And a key way to tell if a sanctuary is a legitimate one is that a legitimate sanctuary doesn't breed animals and doesn't allow human-animal interaction without period or without very robust safeguards in place for the animals. Supporting reputable sanctuaries, like the ones featured on our panel today, is a great way to help animals who have been neglected by our regulatory system. And in the meantime, we'll keep fighting for them. Thank you. Oops, I'm losing my mic.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Senatori, and I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Animal Law Studies. I'm honored to be here with all of you today as we transition to talking about the role of sanctuary for human and animal victims of domestic abuse. And it is, excuse me? I'm sorry, I thought I heard something. It is a topic that's difficult to cover, but I want to start by asking you to consider a question silently. What would you do if the cost of your own personal safety meant leaving someone you love behind? And would it influence your decision if you knew that by leaving your loved one behind, it was very likely they would be injured, harmed, or killed? It's a hypothetical question for purposes of today's discussion, but it is the very brutal reality that victims of domestic violence and intimate partner abuse experience every day. And I'd also like to remind you that if you look around the room today, there are survivors among us who may have had to consider this very question. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men experience domestic violence. So as we transition to talk about this subject, I ask that we hold space with everyone, because in all the other panels, we ask, why should we care about the animals? This is the panel where we're called to ask, why should we care about the people? Because the safety of humans and non-human animals when there is violence in the home are dependent upon one another, and we're called to help. So my own epiphany about the link between domestic violence and animal cruelty came when I was a 2L at the University of Wisconsin Law School. And I, along with my law school friend and the animal advocate, Pam Hart, who you may know, wanted to use our law degree to help animals. And so there was no animal law at the time. There was no animal law. There was animal law generally, but just not at our school. And we were called to the other side of the country to a conference. And I was in a session, and I'll date myself by showing one of these overhead projectors because people didn't use really PowerPoints quite then. And a slide came up. And I'm just going to paraphrase the slide a little bit for those of you who don't want to see the graphic depiction of violence that's described. But it is the words of a domestic abuse counselor at a women's center in Wisconsin who describes how she came in a client came in very apologetic and said, I have to go home. When her counselor said, no, you don't have to go home, she said, no, you don't understand. And she pulled out of her purse a couple of photos and handed them to her that her mother had forwarded to her from her husband, and it depicted him abusing their dog. She said, I have to go home to save the lives of my dog and the other animals on the farm. And the counselor describes her desperation in not having any way to help this client. Wow. I had never thought of this issue before. I'm embarrassed to tell you that with a certificate in women's studies, along with volunteering at my local domestic abuse organization and my local humane society, the fact that domestic violence and animal cruelty were linked was something that I had never considered. That is the terrible choice that we had then and that we still have in this country and around the world. So when we got back to Madison, we started to investigate what kind of resources were available to victims in this situation. And what we found, that was notwithstanding that we were in a college town with resources as robust as Madison, we didn't really have a formal safety net. And so this was the common situation that was going on. A 1995 survey of 72 victims seeking refuge in domestic violence shelters in Wisconsin found that 86% of them had pets, and in 80% of the cases, the abuser had abused the pets. 48% of domestic abuse victims were reporting that they delayed leaving a dangerous situation because they were concerned for the safety and well-being of their animals, and they had no safe place for them. That always makes me wonder how many never left, and how many, like the victim in Wisconsin, who I started this story with, returned to harm in order to protect their animals. My favorite quote, Teddy Roosevelt, do what you can with what you have where you are. So where we were at that time as law students, and a lot of you are in this position, we had a lot of time, but we had no money and we had no animal shelter. And so what we ended up doing was approaching a public interest law professor, because again, there was no animal law. And we created a nonprofit called SAVE, Sheltering Animals of Abuse Victims, that provides temporary confidential shelter to victims, the animals of victims of domestic violence for up to 90 days in Dane County, Wisconsin. And we do that through a collaboration with our domestic abuse agency and our local humane society. 20 years later, 22 years later, I think we are now, I'm happy to share that SAVE continues to thrive. And we've helped over 300 animals impacted by domestic violence. So with that background, I'd like to do a high-level overview of what this has looked like over time in 1992, as we sit here today, and when we all gather together again in 2052. So 30 years ago, there were little to no resources for victims in the position of the victim in Wisconsin who I shared with you. A 1999 study indicated that only 3% of domestic violence agencies, could house pets. Other shelter options for victims were also in short supply. 95% of domestic violence agencies asked victims to use their own resources if they could. And across the country, one of the studies found there were only 113 programs for pets of domestic violence victims in various stages of conception or operation. 113 programs to serve the entire country. Recognition of the link was not particularly widespread. A 1999 survey found that 38.1% of domestic violence agencies provided staff training about the link to their employees. And it wasn't much better with animal people either. 35% of animal welfare agency respondents provided link training. There were no laws. As we sit here today, this is very different, I'm happy to tell you, but there was no state that included an animal in a domestic violence protective order. And the fear that victims had of leaving their animals behind was very warranted based on the research and the likelihood of an abuser threatening or harming or killing a pet. Where do we sit today? I'm happy to tell you that it's much better, but as I will demonstrate, I hope there's a lot more work to do. Today, this is from the Safe Havens Mapping Project, over 1,000 shelter programs that provide refuge for the animals of domestic abuse victims. Again, huge improvement, but the need is still there. A 2021 survey found that 50% of callers stated they would not leave an abuser for shelter if they couldn't take their animals with them, and 48% worried that their abuser would harm or kill their animals. So again, huge progress, but then we have stories like these. This one breaks my heart. So this is the story of Chewy. This is 2017 at the Las Vegas airport. Chewy is found in the bathroom with this note, and I'm going to read it for those of you who can't see it on the screen. Hi, I'm Chewy. My owner was in an abusive relationship and couldn't afford to get me on the flight. She didn't want to leave me with all of her heart, but she has no option. My ex-boyfriend kicked my dog when we were fighting, and he has a big knot on his head. He probably needs a vet. I love Chewy so much. Please love and take care of him. 5 years ago, still victims in this position. We have more shelter options, but they do not typically include co-sheltering animals and their victims together. Now, this statistic, I've seen it kind of in different places. I've seen it from 10% to 12% to 15%. So I've gone with the 10%, but you'll see different numbers. They're all in the same range. That only about 10% of domestic violence programs have some on-site animal facilities for victims to stay with their animals. So what happens is typically, and I'm so proud of the foster model that we have because we have something, but victims are typically being separated from their animals and the animals from their people when they're healing from abuse. The laws are much better today. We now have 39 states plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico that allow animals to be included in domestic violence protective orders. The first state to provide a law like this was Maine in 2006. So you can see how quickly this is expanded. And what was instrumental to that change was victims being able to share their stories about animal cruelty in their relationships. In support of the Maine bill, a very brave victim named Susan Walsh testified about her own experience. Because one of the questions that we get a lot is, well, why did the victim stay? Why doesn't the victim just leave? It's the wrong question, but it's the one that's asked all the time. And so she described why she didn't leave. Despite being there with 2 children and in harm's way, she was fearful that her abuser would target her animals. Why? Because that's exactly what he had done. When she threatened to leave one time, he ran over her beloved blind and deaf border collie, killing him. Another time, he shot 2 of her sheep. He would wring the necks of her turkeys. So it's stories like those that called the legislatures to do something about it, and we've had immense improvement. But again, here too, we can do more. The definition in these laws of the animals that are protected is far too often limited to household pets. This is the definition from my home state in Wisconsin, where our domestic violence protective order law includes only household pets and expressly excludes farmed animals. So the victim in Wisconsin who inspired this work for me could not have protected her farmed animals under Wisconsin's existing law. She could make a property argument, but nobody is returning to their abuser to protect their television. This is a map, thank you to Allie, my law clerk who is out here, who put together based on some of the research she did. The states in light pink are states that, like Wisconsin, exclude farmed animals from the domestic violence protections. The gray states have no laws there. It's undefined in the peach states, and there are only 4 states there that do include farmed animals or livestock. I'm going to touch this point very briefly because David Rosengard did a wonderful job discussing the state versus Abdi Issa case yesterday, but animal cruelty can constitute domestic violence, but we do not recognize it enough in our laws. There's a fantastic decision from the Washington Supreme Court that was issued this summer that found that animal cruelty can constitute domestic violence. And I would go on to say that when it does, it is always 2 victims, both a human and a non-human animal, and our laws need to reflect that. So looking at the next 30 years, where do I hope we are when we meet here again in 2052? I hope that we are doing more to honor the bond between human and animal abuse survivors. 91% of survivors indicated in a study by the PALS program that emotional support and physical protection by animal companions is significant to their ability to heal. 97% of respondents said that keeping their pets with them is an important factor in deciding whether or not to seek abuse or to seek shelter, excuse me. And another thing to just put a point on it, ask yourself what you've considered during my entire presentation today. My guess is that you are considering one adult victim and their pets, but we're forgetting about the children in the families. This one study, just to underscore the importance of children, of their animals to them, that 42% of 5-year-old children mentioned their animals when asked, what do you turn to, who do you turn to when you're feeling sad, angry, happy, or wanting to share a secret? We are, to keep humans safe, we are separating the children from their animals as well. And it's painful for the children to not be able to be sheltered with their animals. So, what can this look like? I hope it looks like more co-sheltering options. And a great example is people and animals living safely in PALS, which is called in New York. Opened in 2019, it's the first domestic abuse shelter in the country that every single apartment unit allows shelter of animals and people together. And I do want to make just an important point. We don't lack this option because domestic abuse advocates and domestic abuse agencies don't care. They understand the issue like we do. It's a question of resources. And for a very long time, they didn't even have resources to protect people. So this is something that we can do with more resources. And we are getting there with some legislative options. So for example, the Pets and Women's Safety Act of 2017, which was signed part of the 2018 Farm Bill, creates a grant program that allows the U.S. Department of Agriculture to award grants for shelter and housing assistance for victims to get support for their pets and to co-shelter pets and their people together. These are the kind of grant awards that have been awarded after over the past several years. And then we have charitable efforts like the Purple Leash Project, which has donated $1 million. I will confess I'm a listener of the Brene Brown podcast, and I'm so inspired every time I hear, like, there's ads actually on podcasts now where they talk about this issue, which used to be in the shadows and nobody even knew about it. So to end on a positive note, given all of those difficult things that we deal with in this field, my favorite things in this work, I teach the companion animal law class. One of my favorite things is when my students go out and start shelter programs and raise awareness and go out and do legislation and help in this field. And then the other is the reunions that I get to do with SAVE. So this is the story that the person at our Humane Society shared about one of our reunions during the pandemic. And she describes that she had the pleasure of doing the SAVE reunion that day. The client didn't speak much English, but she literally collapsed upon seeing her animals. And she wept on her knees in the foyer while holding them. She thanked us 1 million times and kept gesturing that she wanted to hug us, but she couldn't because it was during COVID. So imagine the question I asked you at the outset, And then place yourself in that position in the middle of a pandemic where you don't speak the language in the culture where you're living, or the primary language, and where you are leaving your animals behind, your support network, and they are being separated from her. So in the next 30 years, I'd like to reimagine this story without the need for a reunion. I'd like to imagine that we have laws that include all animals in domestic violence protective orders, not just household pets. And I'd like to imagine that the definition of domestic violence includes animal cruelty when it happens in a household and with intimate partners. And together, I think we can get there, and we'll see you all in 2052 to do it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'll switch back into my moderator role. Thank you for your wonderful presentations and educational presentations. I think now we're in the Q&A period, so anyone feel free to ask questions at the mic, and I can get us started if we don't have any ready.
I'm just switching to that. Oh, there we go. Never mind. I thought it was still up down there.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Lachelier. I work pro bono for the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries, which certifies sanctuaries worldwide, actually, but mostly in the United States. And they have standards. I don't know if any of you are familiar with, they have standards for sanctuaries, you probably are. And so my question was, what are the barriers to developing standards for sanctuaries? I mean, obviously the Federation has them. Colorado and Oregon have adopted aspects of their standards for wildlife, notably for wildlife sanctuaries. But the question, you talked about acceptable sanctuaries and supporting sanctuaries. And so what are the obstacles to developing these standards or making them more uniform in some way, other than obviously getting states to adopt them? Do you have any other ideas or thoughts about the barriers to doing that? Particularly since you operate a sanctuary, I imagine it's onerous to meet these standards and to pay the fees, et cetera. So to the extent there are ways around that or ways to make that easier so that there are some standards. So people know when a sanctuary is a sanctuary or not, kind of like the USDA organic food labels and that kind of thing. Thanks.
Okay, it's on. I think I heard most of that. It was a little echoey, but we are aware of the Global Federation of Farm Sanctuaries. And for our sanctuary, the reason why we haven't moved forward in getting the accreditation is simply just a lack of time and not having the volunteer support that we need, because there's a lot that you have to put together in terms, there's a lot of paperwork involved. So, our animal care is top notch, but then a lot of the paperwork stuff kind of gets pushed off to the side because that's kind of the last thing that we deal with. So, but in the state of Oregon, we actually just started, oddly enough, the Department of Agriculture in Oregon just started a new animal licensing entity. And so they are requiring all sanctuaries and rescues to adhere to a certain very basic level of regulation. So I think that's helpful in terms of places being at least licensed on a very basic level. But yeah, I think the more sanctuaries there's so many people opening sanctuaries every day. I think that there does need to be some sort of regulatory practice. It's just, I don't know how it's going to work, because I don't want that to impact people to not open sanctuaries too. So I think for me, it's still a process, I think.
Okay. I'm sure if Cristina were here doing her presentation, she would have an answer for you, but I can't speak much about to it. But we can follow up with her. Yeah, question here.
Sure. Hey, and maybe this is kind of a follow-up on that, but with the growth, I mean, obviously you're doing such important work that's new, but how can people who want to support good sanctuaries know the animal care standards are there, and also where is the thought now and where might it be going in terms of worker protection and labor standards for people that work at sanctuaries?
I missed the second part of that.
I think, sorry, it's so echoey up here.
This
I
one's
think it's if there's standards for like employees and workers at Farm Sanctuary.
Okay, okay.
Does
So
does that capture it? Yeah.
the first part of the question was, how do you know if you're volunteering at a reputable sanctuary? Well, being able to volunteer is the first clue that it's that they're at least open to having visitors. That's one of the most important things, is that, you know, there's a lot of red flags you can look for a reputable sanctuary. I can name a couple of them, but, you know, taking in animals all the time, but constantly talking about how they don't have funds, that's a red flag. Not allowing people to come visit. But as long as you are able to go to the sanctuary and you can see the animals firsthand, I don't think you need to worry about, I mean, obviously if there's issues, then yes, you would have to pursue those, but we don't have employees at our sanctuary, so I don't know how to answer that in the second half of the question. But if we ever did, it is a concern of mine, making sure that we're hiring people that, you know, are going to do a good job and not, you know, harm the animals in any way. So it would be a process for sure, trying to find appropriate people to work there.
One point that I'll just follow up on there, because I don't want it to be confusing in light of the presentation saying that, you know, you shouldn't allow visitors. So one of the red flags that we look for in sanctuaries is less about allowing visitors and volunteers to come spend time with animals in a way that's respectful of the animal. The red flag for us is more like promoting animal human interaction. So like experiences, especially if people can pay for those experiences or, you know, pay extra for them or anything like that, you know, charging admission, things like that. So I think that there's kind of like a spectrum, you know, there are some sanctuaries, some like the wild animal sanctuary that we mentioned doesn't allow any human animal interaction. You know, like people can come on the property at times, but it's incredibly controlled and there's no direct contact. So that is kind of at one end of the spectrum. And then at the other is places that are marketing themselves as sanctuaries when it's really just a, you know, a disguised zoo, basically, that's prioritizing the human experience over the animal experience. So just in case that clears up any conflict in, you know, helping or supporting sanctuaries like Gwen's, which are very legitimate.
It looks like there's a.
This question is for Megan.
Do you think?
Is it important to have a legal definition of companion animal to enforce the protection of these animals? For example, sometimes a horse might be a companion animal and not a farm animal.
It's a very good question. It sounds like it might have been written by someone who takes my companion animal law class, because it's one of the first things I make everybody do. So the question was, is it important to have definitions of companion animal, or how do we define that if maybe the person's companion is a horse? As you all know, the first question that you have in all of these animal cases is, how does the statute that you're working with define the animals that are protected? And in my view, we should be as broad as possible in this context, and, you know, in my view, all the contexts, but in domestic violence in particular, because this is not limited to companion animals. And statutes that limit it that way are not addressing the reality of abuse. In several of the examples that I gave today, it was not companion animals, it was farmed animals. And when you have an abuser who is using animals as part of coercive control over their human counterparts and their family, doesn't matter what kind of animal it is. And so that I hope that our definitions are more expansive and that we look at the facts in the particular case as opposed to the species of the animal, because it's too limiting the way we have it right now. So I hope that sort of answers the question, but the definitions are important. That's why we need to broaden them, in my view.
Question here.
Hi, my name is Olivia. I'm a 3L at Suffolk University in Boston. My first year and second year of school, I did focus on advocating for survivors of domestic and sexual assault. So I worked at the Family Advocacy Clinic, and one of my clients did have a very similar situation of the abuser targeting the animal, her dogs. So I was wondering about restraining orders, if there is work being done either by you or anybody else about trying to include animals to be protected under a restraining order that a survivor is getting against their abuser. And if the abuser violates it, that is a crime itself.
Yeah, so it's echoey, so I don't know if everybody can hear the question or not. I'll sort of repeat it. She's been working with survivors of domestic violence and protective orders. And the question was about efforts to include animals in the protective orders. And yes, those are the 39, they're all very different. So it's hard to say what they're all like, but there are 39 states that now have those laws. In many of them, animal cruelty is not the basis to get the domestic violence restraining order, but once the order is issued, animals can be included within it. And in the Pets and Women's Safety Act that was passed, it does make it federally criminalizes interstate travel to try to violate one of those domestic violence protective orders that includes pets. So there are certainly being advancements made in this area, and it's an important one that all of us lawyers have to keep working at.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you know if the survivor has to show that the abuser has already harmed the animal? Like, what standard do judges look at if the animal's already been harmed, if there's a risk, if it's imminent?
And that question was, what is the standard that the victim has to show to obtain the restraining order? And it's different in every statute. So every state is different in what the standards are. In many of them, the victim has to show harm to themselves. So it's not harm to the animals that counts. I think it should be. But in many of them, they have to demonstrate, abuse. It's often a pattern of abuse. It can be physical abuse. It can be sexual abuse. It can be, in some of them, in Wisconsin, before we had the protective order law, damage or threat to property, ironically counted for domestic violence, but abusing an animal to torment your partner did not. So I can't give you a great answer because it's very different based on each statute, but that should give you a bit of a sense.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you bet.
Longtime supporter of Lighthouse. And I was wondering, because this panel hasn't addressed it to this point, and I'm wondering what resources people who are doing sanctuary work, who maybe don't ordinarily have proximity or access to legal help or legal advice when legal issues come up. Is there any kind of centralized resource or someone to refer them to? Because, for example, I've been practicing for 9 years, but my practice is so specialized that I don't necessarily feel competent to jump on an animal law issue that might come up for a sanctuary. So I would like to know if there's somewhere to refer them to that's actually going to be helpful for them and not create, not send them down a rabbit hole. Is there anything like that, or is there a need for something like that to be developed? Like some kind of, I don't know, like a hotline, like an attorney of the day, or if Animal Legal Defense Fund has some kind of, you can send an email and that kind of thing, anything like that. So that people who are doing sanctuary work have some kind of access to legal help when they need it. And obviously it would need to be a pro bono kind of program, or attorneys who feel able to provide that service on a pro bono basis.
I can speak a little bit about ALDF, and then I don't know if you want to share where you look. Yeah. Yes, so at ALDF, when we get folks are welcome to ask us questions like that. If we can't address them ourselves, then we often refer them out to our pro bono network, which is just a network of lawyers across the country in all different types of practice areas and contexts, like firms and individual practitioners who are able to help, who actually would know more about the local law than we do. There are times, at ALDF, we focus on like impact litigation, so a little bit less individual cases, like problems that people are encountering, at least for our civil litigation program. But there have been times where people present us questions where it makes us realize, for example, like how sanctuaries are really disadvantaged in terms of how a local zoning ordinance might work, or, people being, just opportunities for kind of systemic change, even if it's on a local level, to help support sanctuaries. So we are really interested in getting involved in those things. Outside of that, I think we would refer it out to our pro bono network. But I don't know, do you have anything to add in terms of where you would go for legal advice?
Yeah, for me, it would be the Animal Legal Defense Fund. And our sanctuary Lighthouse has definitely utilized the pro bono services, and a number of my friends as well who run sanctuaries, even in other countries, have been able to utilize those services as well and help out with some simple problems that they have. So yeah, it's not, it's not foolproof, but it's an excellent resource, I think.
So that if there's someone, even in another state, who's doing sanctuary work and needs legal advice, ALDF is a potential resource that I can legitimately tell them this is someone you can contact who may be able to refer you to someone in their network.
Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think there's a form online that you can fill out, like if you go to the pro bono section of the website, there's a form that people can fill out for more information.
Yeah, legal help request form.
Hey, guys. Hey, thanks for everything you guys do. You're a real inspiration. I have a question regarding the term nonprofit. Earlier this year, I was down in Florida. And for whatever reasons, I came across a place that was calling itself the Mayaka Elephant Ranch, a nonprofit conservation center. I did a little vetting because I knew enough to know that I should question whether or not I should be supporting them. And apparently they claim to have donated $50,000 to the International Elephant Foundation. But when I go back and so they seem legitimate. I went through with the experience. I paid like $180 to, wash, and scrub the elephants, hang out with them, feed them, pet them. But at the same time, after I did a little more digging and talked to them some more, they weren't familiar with some people that are doing wonderful work in Africa, such as Damien Mander with the International Anti-Poaching Foundation. So I walked away having mixed feelings and not being sure. And I also know in the healthcare industry, there are a lot of hospitals that claim to be nonprofit. And yet when you look at the average salaries for these CEOs, some of them are making as much as $21 million a year. So I was wondering, with your expertise, when you hear the word nonprofit, is that a red flag to you guys, or do you have any information you can share on that? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I can say in terms of what we look for in red flags for places that are accredited, places that are kind of like exploiting whatever standards do exist. I mean, as far as I know, there's no national standard for what a sanctuary is. Nonprofit is different. Like, you do have to meet some specific, requirements of the tax code and things that I can't personally speak to. But in the sanctuary context, we definitely see that word being exploited and misused and, just misleading, the public. And so it is something that we monitor, and we're really interested in trying to tackle to make sure that people aren't diverting money away from legitimate sanctuaries to ones that are just profiting off of animals in the same way that a private facility would. But yeah, in terms of like nonprofit more broadly, it's not something that we work on, or not something I have expertise in, so I can't speak to it in too much detail, but some high level thoughts.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah. We have a question from online.
Where can a sanctuary owner find the comprehensive animal care standards as they want to get started on filing for a nonprofit?
I couldn't hear it either.
Can you repeat
If-
that?
If somebody is looking to get started with a nonprofit, where would you suggest they go to look for comprehensive animal care standards?
I would suggest the Open Sanctuary Project. I believe that's what it's called. But it's an online database that it's been created by, they're a nonprofit as well. And they created excellent resources for basically every species of care. Also, how to run a volunteer program, how to set up your 501c3, how to do record keeping. I mean, they have everything there. And it's an excellent resource for people that want to open up a sanctuary. And they've pulled this information from people that have been working in the sanctuary world for years and years and years. So it's an excellent resource.
Great, I have one more. Should rescues and sanctuaries be regulated by licensing from the government?
Can you hear that?
Should we be licensed and regulated by the government? Is that?
Yes, correct.
So like I mentioned before, we're currently in Oregon. Just recently, the Oregon Department of Agriculture started regulating sanctuaries and rescues. And for me, it's a tricky subject because, as we all know, typically the Department of Agriculture doesn't really care about farmed animals. So it's a little weird that they're regulating us. And it's a little frustrating that they have these basic standards of care, which are great for sanctuaries, but then my neighbor can be like abusing his animals and leaving them in, mud and not shearing their sheep and just, horrible conditions that are just like accepted because that's okay. So I would prefer to see a different regulatory body that's not the government, because I don't think that they can be trusted. I mean, to make the best decisions for farmed animals, because obviously they don't have a great track record doing that.
Well, I'm cognizant that I can ask you all questions anytime I'd like, so I want to make sure other people have the opportunity. But because no one else is, I'm going to go ahead. I appreciated the conversation about the importance of shelter together programs and the recognition that the problem is not lack of knowledge, it's lack of resources. I'm wondering, have you encountered other structural barriers to that, whether that's particular laws that exclude certain animals or certain breed types, whether it's insurance policies make it difficult for shelters to accept animals? I'm just trying to plot out what all of the barriers are so we can figure out how to surmount them.
Yeah, that's a great question. In my experience, the barrier has just been, I'll just give you the experience in Madison, Wisconsin. Our domestic abuse shelter until 10 or so years ago was a house in a residential area that I used to have to sign a confidentiality agreement to say that I would never disclose the location. We kept domestic violence here and so many places around the country in the shadows. And because of that, it wasn't visible within the community. So people knew that they had to support them. And then when you look in a room, your friends, your colleagues, your coworkers, your family members, there are so many survivors among us and they don't identify who they are. And so what changed for us was being able to, our domestic abuse shelter, I don't take credit for this, took a new model and they did a capital campaign. So they got the support of the community to support it. And the shadow is not in, or the shelter is not in a confidential location now. It's visible, it's part of the community. It's like a beacon of hope. And people know that it's there so that if they need resources, and there is a place there where someone could, it's a temporary stop before they get to save. But there is at least a place where if someone needs to leave and it's an emergency and their animals are there, they can come with till they get into our program. So I guess I feel like it's more awareness raising, more consciousness raising. I don't even feel like we've gotten far enough to figure out what the insurance barriers and breed restrictions and that kind of stuff are, because our fellow domestic abuse advocates have been clamoring to get anybody to take domestic violence seriously for so long. So we need to work hand in hand to try to figure this problem out together. So, yeah. Great question.
We have 2 minutes in case anyone has been holding off from asking a question.
My question's a little bit tangential. I was wondering if outside of domestic violence, people fleeing other dangerous situations, whether it's people experiencing homelessness or fleeing natural disasters like hurricanes, and they don't leave their dangerous situation because they don't want to leave their animals behind. So wondering if you had any insight into programs that were supporting people like that.
Yeah. It's a great, so the question was about in other contexts where someone has to leave an animal behind, natural disasters. We saw that hugely in Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Harvey. We're seeing that in Ukraine with the situation, people trying to leave with their animals. So it's certainly not limited to domestic violence. And the laws evolve in response to what we see on the news. So everybody might remember, well, I don't know if everybody's old enough to remember, but during Hurricane Katrina, the little boy who started just throwing up uncontrollably when he had to be separated from his dog Fluffy. At that time, you could not take animals with you on public transport and to do other things if you were fleeing a natural disaster. And the I'm trying to think of, what is it? Pets Emergency Evacuation Transportation Safety Act, something like that. Passed after that now require jurisdictions to get federal disaster relief money have to have a plan so that people can take their animals with them when they flee a natural disaster. That has changed things so that you didn't see the same type of situation in some of the other natural disasters. So again, I think it's storytelling, it's talking about these situations so people know about it. And then the laws, they're slow to evolve, but they do catch up to address the problem. So it's a great question because it's not limited to just domestic violence and intimate partner abuse. You do see it in other contexts too.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all of your very thoughtful questions, and thank you for joining us on the panel.